Everybody for the final class, Democracy 12. I actually wore buttoned my jacket and wore my Maryland tie. Like my glasses on. And I also try to be able to do two things at one time. And just this third class, we're talking about the Maryland elections, 1861 and 1863. We'll be able to talk a little bit about General Tillman and Carmichael. So we're backing up a little bit in time. The second class, we're about the Maryland legislature. And we took it to where they got imprisoned. I never continued on about what happened during their imprisonment. It's in my book. And it was not very pleasant. For a long while, they had a bag of straw to sleep on. They had some pork fat crackers to eat. They froze in the winter and roasted in the summer. And it wasn't very good, at least through the fortresses. When they got to Boston Harbor under Colonel Dimmick, they were treated a little bit better. And Colonel Dimmick realized what was going on, he did the best he could, and they had a situation where they could afford to buy their own meals. They did, and their situation got a lot better. And the main thing here is early on, they weren't treated very well, but they also were held sequestered. There was no information. The legislature was not allowed any communications inside or out whatsoever until after the elections of 1861, and they started to ease up a little bit. So that was just to fill you in a little bit. My book covers in much more detail. And the course rules, I want to keep the questions at the end because sometimes you want to ask a question, but just 2 slides later, it's answered for you. And please be courteous and respectful for all our discussions. Quick overview. We talked about the Maryland legislature coming together in April of 1861, and they did certain things, proclamations. And they proclaimed to the people of Maryland and to the world that they had no constitutional authority to secede, to issue a secession ordinance, no constitutional authority from the Maryland Constitution. And they say that they will not call a sovereign convention to people, they will not arm or put the militia in a state of readiness, or they won't do anything that would be construed as possibly hostile to the federal government. They also proclaimed that they thought the war being prosecuted by Mr. Lincoln was unconstitutional, and that Maryland would have no part in this war. And in Maryland seeks only peace and reconciliation. They sent out their peace commissioners to meet with Lincoln and Davis for the hope of putting off any hostilities until Congress can meet those sort of things. And they proclaimed that they thought the best hope of future reconciliation between the North and South would be to let the South go in peace. They did protest, however. They protested against the unlawful arrest of Maryland citizens. And they protested against the numerous constitutional violations that they saw. And they protested against the tyrannical assertions of military rule over Marylanders and the Maryland government. So we also covered about House Delegate Ross Winnett when he was coming home from the first session. When he was on the train, sitting next to Governor Hicks. They stopped at Relay House, and the federal troops took him off and arrested him, and they had obviously denied him habeas corpus. And when we found that it was General Butlers, he was in charge of the Massachusetts militia. It was his intention to have him tried by a military court-martial in his choosing to ensure his conviction. And he wanted to have Winnett publicly executed, teach Marylanders a lesson. And as I mentioned, that source comes right from Butler's autobiography. He talked about ex parte Merryman and Judge Roger B. Taney, who was the Chief Justice of the United States, sitting on the Maryland court, and Taney cites numerous constitutional violations, not just habeas corpus. And he told, and President Lincoln basically ignored Taney's ruling, and we also saw how the North started labeling Taney a traitor, and some articles even called for his imprisonment and be hung like a dog. Takeover of Baltimore. We saw how the police chief was imprisoned and how they appointed a federal provost marshal to supersede the police commissioners. And of course, this happened after Baltimore was disarmed and turned their guns. We saw the imprisonment of the police commissioners and habeas corpus was denied. And the police commissioners got a protest to the U.S. Congress. And he sent a copy of the protest to the state legislature. Congress passed a resolution, asked President Lincoln, what grounds are you arresting the Baltimore police commissioners? To which President Lincoln states, due to public safety, he cannot tell you. Then when the legislature convened for the last time in August. They were dealing with all these arrests and what was happening with Maryland, and they created what we call, for short, the Wallace Report, after the committee's chairman, Severn T. Apple Wallace. And they voted to deliver this report throughout the nation, to through all the states, all the governors, and they ordered 25,000 copies to be printed. And it was a detailed protest and a list of the constitutional violations they were seeing that was happening against Maryland and her citizens and committed by the federal government. The next day, President Lincoln takes control of the dissemination of all military communications by the press under penalty of court-martial and death. And within a little more than a week after Lincoln took control of the dissemination of military information, we start seeing a series of these what we call fake news articles. And it was disseminated worldwide. Every major paper in the United States, every major paper in Europe that spoke English, I found it there, versions of it. There was a series of them. And the central theme of that was General Tench Tillman was organizing a secessionist army and going to lead an attack against the nation's capital. The Maryland legislature was coordinating with Beauregard and Johnson, the Confederate Army, and the Maryland legislature issued its ordinance of secession. And at the same time, the whole Confederate Army would cross the Potomac and attack the nation's capital by the flank. We saw General Tillman's denial in the New York Herald, and he stated he is not organized as a secessionist, he has not taken command of our army, does not know about any of this, and he's going to hold accountable whoever's making these accusations against him. However, it was really only published in the New York Herald. Some other papers made minor mention of it, so it really did not get the attention that it should have. And then we see on September 12th, the day of, the full front page of the New York Herald was a map of the Confederate Army in a position to cross the Potomac and to attack the nation's capital. And the ensuing article said there was 150,000 to 200,000 Confederates. Now, this military information, it had very detailed. Here's where the command centers are, here's where the troops are. Dissemination of military information such as this certainly fell within Lincoln's censorship. But in researching all this, using the records of the Confederate and the Union Army, it's not supported. The Union generals were not concerned in the least about an attack at the time. We found Union General Stone, who was in charge of the observation point on the Potomac, was repeatedly stating that there is no large army across. I don't see anything. There's just really nothing there. The Union generals were actually taking little vacations. Mark E. Neely, in his Pulitzer Prize when he wrote The Fate of Liberty, mentioned about the attack on Washington, or how there was a, what do you say, there was rumors of attack. And Mark E. Neely research it also says Union generals weren't concerned. But that was the leadoff of what was supposed to happen that night. And that's when the arrest began, right at midnight. And it started in the city of Baltimore. All the legislature members that were there, Mayor Brown, U.S. Congressman Henry May, and very significantly, Frankie Howard and other newspaper editors. So we see this suppression of the press. More fake news after the arrest started. I found articles about how the Confederate attack plan had been foiled, that the arrest of the legislature foiled their whole plans and wouldn't dare cross the Potomac. But they also say there was ordinance of secession found amongst the members, and their indisputable proof had been found. Of course, in my research, I found about numerous newspaper reports about how the 3rd Wisconsin was only instructed to vote for those who voted yea on the Wallace Report. And this is a different article than I showed you last time, and this one talks about how the Wallace Reports will be used for electioneering. And keep in mind, Maryland elections and elections of other states are about to happen that fall. And this big 25-page report, actually it's more than that, attachments, that's what he said now. So the big key for the 3rd Wisconsin was to not only arrest those members who voted yea for it, but also to find, report, and destroy all copies. But I also found in a Wisconsin newspaper a direct personal account of one of the members of the 3rd Wisconsin. On Tuesday, our regiment under command of Colonel Ruckers, and he recounts how we were instructed to arrest only those who voted for the Wallace Report. I didn't talk about it in the last class, but we also have a record from Lord Lyons. Lord Lyons was the British ambassador to the United States. He had a conversation on November 4th with Secretary Seward about all these arrests going on. And Secretary Seward told him that as to the recent arrests, they had almost all been made in view of the Maryland elections, that those elections would be over in about a week's time. So after all the legislature's arrests on September 17th, President Lincoln makes a statement in Baltimore American. And he basically states to Marylanders that, hey, the evidence about these arrests is indisputable. The government holds all this information. And once it's made public, there'll be no doubt. But due to public safety, I can't reveal what that evidence is at this time. And now here we are 162 years later, and the federal government hasn't ponied up any evidence whatsoever. There's nothing in the National Archives. Secession witnesses have never been found, or any of that proof whatsoever. That was pretty much class 2, but then we had some very good questions, and I had a long day, so I wasn't really all that great in answering questions. But one of the questions was, were the constitutional violations limited to Maryland? The answer to that is absolutely no. I had a whole chapter book, how to move northward, but Maryland was granted 0. And what I thought was very interesting is how the North changed their tune when it was happening to them. When it was happening in Maryland, the North was going, well, they're the secessionists, they're disloyal. They get what they deserve. Then they move north, and like, whoa, 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 not to us. And by October of 1862, the habeas corpus had been suspended nationwide. And in that order, it basically made any constable, sheriff, or officer, military officer, they had the right to imprison any citizen for any act of disloyalty. It was up to that military officer or constable to decide what disloyalty was. Other stuff that happened northward, General Burnside, after he was relieved of command of the Union Army, he gave him command of the department in Ohio, and he issued order number 38, and basically said the Senate is punishable by court-martial and fire squad. And in his jurisdiction, we had Clement Vallandigham. And Clement Vallandigham was one of President Lincoln's political rivals for the upcoming election. And Clement gave a speech, and Burnside goes, that is disloyal, and had him arrested, court-martialed, and imprisoned for the whole life of the war. President Lincoln did intervene and commuted his sentence to be banished to the South. So this is basically to answer questions about, did it move north? And very quickly, I think I talked about this. When the arrest started moving north, saw Governor Horatio Seymour and his attorney Obie Hall actually had General Dix indicted. That's a whole separate story, but they did that. And then we had the New Yorkers, the New York Democrats, led by Erastus Corning. They gave a protest to President Lincoln, who actually responded. It has a very famous Corning letter. It's great insight on what President Lincoln was thinking. Then we had a wonderful question from a gentleman over here about Supreme Court rulings. So we'll bring that up right now. And he mentioned the Price Case Act of 1863. And exactly right. The Supreme Court in 1863 said President Lincoln definitely has, presidents have the right to defend their nation. Congress isn't always in session. So I would definitely say the call for the 75,000 troops, maybe what he did to the Southern Wars, was certainly within his rights. But the president can't initiate war, and only Congress can authorize prolonged war. And just a comment on the president. I know we're hard on Lincoln in these past couple classes. We got a few more things to name on. And I put in my book, and I kind of said it here in the first class, is that what I want you to relate to is more of how we learn from it. Some people will try to defend Lincoln. We should have. Okay, the question I already got for you to learn from this is if you want a president today or a president in the future to assume such gross amount of power and usurp the Constitution because he feels like he needs to. And when I ask and talk to people about this, they'll say, well, it depends on the situation. I'm like, no, it doesn't depend. There's only one thing we have in our nation to keep the powers of the president in check, and that's the Constitution, really. And you want him to have the power to usurp it as he sees fit for issues that he thinks important, or do you want him to respect it? And that's where we want to think going forward for all of this, is about the power that was taken, the elections and everything, and also to see the slippery slope once you go down that, and how people can be manipulated.
Well, you've seen that in other countries too.
What's that?
You've seen that in other countries.
I've seen that in other countries. Yes, absolutely. Russia, for example, they started to try to be democratic after the fall of communism, and we know what happened there. It's easy to lose. It's hard to keep your freedoms. And if you think that, it's okay for the president this time, that time, I kind of think we're playing Russian roulette. Because one of these times, it might be 100 years, power's going to be grabbed and it'll never come back to the people. Just my opinion. So, Prize Case Act. Another Supreme Court rule I was going to talk when I talk about Judge Carmichael, but I'll talk about it now. There we go. Ex parte Milligan, 1866. This is a landmark case. And what the Supreme Court ruled is that the military cannot rule over civilian authorities in states that are not in rebellion, and that has their government and their courts in operation. And they ruled that trying civilians in a military court, a court bar, was unconstitutional. Citizens have a right to trial by jury. And they also ruled that suspension of habeas corpus for an individual has to be limited duration. It can't be put him in jail, throw away a key. Now, they did not address whether the president had the right or not to suspend it, because that point was made. By the time the Supreme Court ruled this, Congress had acted in 1863 for the suspension. But following court cases firmly put it that it's a power of Congress, not the president. So Milligan is so important here because when we talk about Merryman, it vindicates Judge Taney. Judge Taney was correct. He says these are violations. It also vindicates the state legislature. They were complaining about military rule and court martial, and that's legislature's correct. It vindicates also Judge Carmichael. We had a judge in Pennsylvania try to indict federal officers for unlawful arrest, and Horatio Seymour, all that stuff. So,
But the bottom three will rely on the top item.
I'm sorry, what's that?
The bottom three will rely on that, on the first bullet point. States not in rebellion where the courts are open. So if the state is in rebellion, if it's considered in rebellion, or the courts
Yes,
are
I'm not gonna,
all those things.
correct. I'm not gonna go but what they ruled was Maryland, like Ohio, where I showed Ohio wasn't a rebellion. Maryland was a rebellion. If you go to Virginia, this wouldn't apply. They were talking about the states that were in rebellion. In fact, if you look into it, it's actually, there's a close line, there's combat going on, but the bottom line, if you're living in Maryland, Maryland's seceded, I got a government operation, you can't go in and establish a provost marshal to overrule the government. If the government thinks I committed a crime, then they have to try me to a civilian court. So that's the main things there that Ex parte Milligan had said. And Maryland, as you recall, did not secede from the Union.
So to that point, does that mean that before Maryland seceded, well, Maryland didn't
So,
secede.
what is it? Rebellion is an interpretive phrase. I mean, you can interpret rebellion to mean almost anything you want, which could take into account the next three.
Right.
Hey, you're a rebellion. I am? Well, while we're deciding that, by the way, I'm taking you out the other three.
Well, I mean,
So.
who decides whether you're in rebellion or not? In this case,
It's kind of hard.
yeah, I mean, well, I think what they meant was the states of Maryland, Ohio, New York, all the northern states. We saw the civilians, and all the northern states had the provost marshal. I can show you how General Burnside was ruling over civilian authority. And in all the states, we had court martials for civilians. That's how Milligan got to it. He wanted him to be hanged. In fact, he found President Lincoln actually sent a letter, please carry out the sentence as soon as possible, because he didn't want to appeal, and that the suspension of habeas has to be of as short a duration as possible to bring a civilian before a civilian trial to assess what his crimes be. So yes, Milligan certainly applies to Maryland. I mean, I don't know, but anyway. Constitutional violations of President Lincoln. I would refer you to The Broken Constitution by Bill Felton. Excellent book. And the guy who wrote it is a constitutional law professor at Harvard University, or was he wrote the book. So I think he brought a pretty good source there to analyze that. Now we're getting into Maryland Civil War elections. So that's going to review quickly the elections in Maryland. And first of all, the imprisonments that we just had, the legislature, U.S. congressmen, police commissioner, that kind of put a damper on things. Not many people are going to say, yeah, I can run for an election when you just saw your representative to the House be in prison and haul off. But the imprisonments also created vacancies now that have to be filled for these elections. And what I found here in early historians, here's Frank Kent, stated that during the war, the ballot was denied every man known or suspected to be in sympathy with the Confederacy. The polls were surrounded by federal soldiers, test oaths and intimidation tactics employed by the military and the politicians that stood behind it disenfranchised free force of the citizens of Maryland. That's what a historian said back then. I never trust historians too much. I always do my own research, as you will see. The election of 1861 started off with the Baltimore City Council elections in October. And the feds took very close notice and control of those elections. And the reason being because of those council members to be elected, one of them would be appointed mayor of Baltimore by that council. And if you recall, Mayor Brown had this very president. So he took very good control of that. And then in November 61 elections, we know the entire House of Delegates was up for election, half the Senate and the governorship. For the city council elections, Matthew Page Andrews states no opposition was permitted. And the size of the vote poll indicated that the citizens regarded the ballot as a mere formality. And then when I did my research on the numbers, the voter turnout was 1/3 of what it was in the previous re-election. And then the new council appointed Lee Chapman, an unconditional unionist, as mayor of Baltimore. From the city council elections, researching that is where I found that they had 120 election judges that quit in protest on illegality. And then I discovered that the federal probate board replaced them with men who were choosing the election judges for the November elections. October 20th, 1861, it suspended habeas corpus for the upcoming elections. And then John Thomas Scarf said, and that was to imprison its unionists that may interfere with the right of suffrage of the Union citizens. And now we see the proclamation of General Dix, and this was published in all the papers, and he meant it to be for his provost marshals, his military officers, the vice police, the new police force got appointed in Baltimore, and the election judges, new election judges. And this is very important. It says, by virtue of the authority vested in me to arrest all persons in rebellion against the United States, requires you to take into custody all such persons in any election districts or precincts in which they may appear at the polls to effect their criminal attempt to convert the elected franchise in an engine for the subversion of the government. And this was published in all the papers. He wanted it published in all the papers. And he also ordered a placard at the polls. They put placards up at the polls starting 2 days prior, places of polling. And the placards at the polls said to point out to the election judges anyone that may have engaged in hostilities against the United States or conducted other disloyal acts. And the people already knew that they were going to be arrested. They were pointed out and had a little bit of a chilling effect. And then we go, John Thomas Scarf wrote in his version of this history, his spaciously worded proclamation deceived no one. It was indisputable, as was the placard posted at the polls, a direct invitation to the officials and agents of the government to use their power for the purpose of intimidating or otherwise excluding from the ballot box all voters who were likely to cast their ballots against the administrative candidates. I'm all for sorry about it. There's the placard, we're right here. So this is Thomas Scarf, and he said it was basically to intimidate, and Thomas Scarf said hundreds of citizens were arrested without the slightest pretext to keep from voting. That's what he said. So I, in my own research, what did I find? One, I found a letter from General Shriver to General Butler, and it talks about how, read this, in Frederick, if we send men out, and at polling day, at election day, it'll keep the disloyal from voting and keep them away from the polls. They talked about how to deploy cavalry out in the election districts. And you already saw this article, and what I found in the Baltimore Sun, election yesterday arrest. It said during election days that the federal police started imprisoning everyone, and it said the reasons for it, and voting a treasonable ticket. And he said basically the Democrats got word and they stayed home. And attempted to pollute the ballot box to offer to vote treasonable Democratic tickets. And so that's kind of a smoking gun right there. And it backs up the early historians who were saying about the intimidations. Now also, I'm only showing you a portion of this. In this Baltimore Sun article, lists about 160 names of individuals who were arrested and what they were arrested for. So they actually had names attached to this. And in my research, I also found that their Democrat candidates were arrested just prior to or during the election. And I found this in the War Rebellion, and this is from General Hooker to General Williams. Perry Davis, the secessionist candidate for legislature, was arrested at Fort Tobacco and brought to me for making treasonable speeches during the campaign. Now, so not only does this show about the pre-election arrest, but look at the use of secessionist candidate and treasonable speeches. Remember class 1, we started defining that? So what the secessionist was and what he really means here is this candidate is not supporting President Lincoln's war policies. I find that again and again and again and again starting in here. And they started calling that treason. So if you recall, loyal person was loyal to Lincoln and his war policies, and disloyal was the others. Found for the Eastern Shore, a guy named James Alfred Pierce. He was president of Washington College in 1861. Stated that in Kent County and military camps were established at various points to overall the voters who not favored candidates of the Union Party. But the proof is in the numbers. And for the 1861 elections, for Baltimore City, voter turnout was down 33% total, but for Democrats, it was down by 80%. And of course, elections statewide for 61 went almost unanimously for unconditional unionist candidates, and Augustus Bradford, an unconditional unionist, was governor. I did an analysis of the vote count by county, and also found a War Rebellion where the generals were talking back and forth. They identified certain counties that had secessionist candidates, and just before the election, they sent out cavalry to try to impact that. It was a last-minute ordeal, but what I found was in the counties where they sent out the cavalry or the had Union soldiers, the vote count was down about 5%. But in the counties that did not have Union troops, it was up 5%. So it might be a 10%. But the main effort of the 61 elections was Baltimore City. As you remember, it accounted for 1/3 of all Maryland voters. And in Baltimore City, they had already replaced election judges, they replaced the police, and everything under wraps there, and they controlled the elections very, very tightly. I also found for the 61 elections, evidence of the military voting in the elections. And this is right here in Easton. We have voted in your county. All wish we were here for the fall. So obviously this was election prior to the fall elections, but that's for the second Delaware regiment. One to the election of 1863. Now technically, I see in my book, the subjugation of Maryland is kind of complete after 61 elections. All unconditional unionists, the seats were filled, but the 63 elections were so overt, so atrocious that interference that I had to include it. And the reason it was right here. By the 63 elections, the First Amendment was absolutely, totally suppressed. And you can do what you want. Remember, you can do what you want, you don't have a free press. The 63 elections included most, if not all, the counties. And the election was also included an election for certain congressmen from Maryland, U.S. Congress. And we found that there was a showdown between President Lincoln and Governor Bradford. And this is really gets interesting. For research of the election of 63, it was pretty easy because the Maryland State Senate did a full investigation report about it. And it's published right in the Maryland State Archives. It wasn't too much of the press because the press again was censored, but the Senate did an investigation. This is the unionist sitting in Maryland. Again, the 63 elections began with the Baltimore City Council, and I just found an article in the Baltimore Sun. There will be no opposition to what is known as a Union Party. The reason for this being generally understood, it requires no explanation on our hands. Kind of also shows they were being kind of delicate, because you can get yourself, a one-way ticket to Fort Lafayette if you said the wrong thing in the press during this period. We found pre-election arrests. This came from the Maryland Senate investigation. Arrested at night, dragged from their peaceful homes, defined as prisoners. That was referring to 4 or 5 people over in Kent County who were running for election. And I also showed you right here in Tulsa County. They did it from the first class. They're defined as secessionist and rebel. It was the actually in Baltimore Sun. But the Democrats came in convention at the courthouse and they nominated all the candidates to want to run for which election. And after they figured out who was going to run for surveyor, you had Ted Stillman running for, the son of Johnson running for surveyor, Orphans Court commissioners. And after they appointed who's going to run for what, almost immediately, in the next couple of days, the local provost marshal with Union officers, Union troops, basically arrested them all. And they did let them out on $1,000 bail. I guarantee you, the conditions of the release, do not run for office. $1,000 worth of money back time. But the important thing here also is that says the charges for the arrest are not stated, but the Gazette charges the parties of being rebels and secessionists. Again, the political labels were secessionists, they were rebels. I doubt anyone that was running for Orphans Court in Talbot County in 1863 was trying to secede Maryland from the Union.
Why?
Yes.
Why do you think nobody?
I'm sorry.
Why do you think nobody here wanted to secede? Why?
Nobody here wanted to see.
Succeed.
Oh, to secede. I don't want to say that. There's certainly plenty of people throughout the state who wanted Maryland to secede. But one of the part of my book is that the secession movement was greatly exaggerated because of some of these political labels they placed. And it wasn't nearly as strong. Once you look into what these secessionists were doing, it wasn't nearly as strong. And we found that there was a lot of fake news that we saw about General Tillman. Because Maryland wanted to remain neutral. They thought the South had the right to secede because people had the right to choose their own government, but Maryland wanted to remain neutral. And that point of view could not be. You had to be either pro-war or against the war. So there was no middle ground.
So were you saying that no one would want to run for Charles, what is it, Orphans Court?
Oh, yeah. So what I'm saying here is that they label all these Democrats as rebels and secessionists. And I want to bring home here, one, they did pre-election arrests, but I want to bring home also the use of political labels. Is that, do you really think someone runs for Orphans Court was trying to secede Maryland from the Union? That's not their objective. They wanted to be, the term label as rebels and secessionists here means they were a different political party than when President Lincoln and that party that was promoting war. So, political label.
Does that answer your question?
Does that make common sense?
Well, no, I mean, how do you know that they didn't want to go to war?
With these particular people right here?
How do you know that the people in Maryland did not want to secede? I mean,
Okay, so reading a lot of newspapers. Huge amount of
but you have to
newspapers.
be careful because you're telling us about fake news.
Yeah, reading, you're right, you gotta, so reading, for example, the Daily Exchange, and Frank E. Howard, grandson of Frank, the secessionist newspaper, I read everything they had. What was he saying? He was complaining about the constitutional violations. Never said. The most I've heard about Maryland in public papers was that if, one, there is we're getting off subject here, if there is a choice, if we can freely choose without war, then we should allow the people to vote. Another thing I heard was,
Like Iraq,
I'm sorry?
like the Iraqi war.
Maybe, but so most I heard in the papers was if they didn't want war, if we get a choice to freely decide, if there's no war, let the people decide. Another thing I heard was after the war decide, another one, as long as Washington is in Maryland, we will not let the people vote, but if they move the capital. I never saw hardly anything, at least publicly, expressed about wanting to secede. I did see a few petitions in the legislature from people in Anne Arundel County, a group of people wanting them to secede. I did see that. But the most of everything I saw was, one, they did not want war. They did not want Maryland to secede, but they thought the southern states had the right to do that. So
Well, it sounds like
we're gonna get questions at the end. Okay, so we're never get through this. But anyway, so pre-election arrest, we see here right in Talbot County. And then we have General Dix Order number 53. And this is basically, he's taken the same game plan that General Dix did in the 61 elections. And he put out a general order, and it was supposed to be to his provost marshals and to his military, but it's published throughout the state. And he says, it is known that there are many evil disposed persons now at large in the state of Maryland who have been engaged in rebellion against laws and lawful government, where I've given aid and comfort or encouragement to others so engaged. or who do not recognize the allegiance to the United States, and who may avail themselves to force enemies of the United States into power. And it goes on to say, after that, he orders the provost marshals and union officers to arrest all such persons found out or hanging about the polls. And it was up to the provost marshals and union officers to decide who such persons were, and they had placards put up in the polls that the arrest will be in, disloyal will be in prison, to point out this law, just like General Dix did in the previous election. And then we have Governor Bradford had a problem with that. Governor Bradford attempted to put out a proclamation to the people of Maryland and to his election judges. And his proclamation said to the citizens of Maryland, and more importantly, the election judges, this extraordinary order, which is referring to General Schneck's, has not only been issued without any consultation with the constituted authorities of the state, but at a time and under circumstances when the condition of the state and the character of the candidates are such as to include the idea that the result of the election can in any way engender either the safety of the government or the peace of the community. And Bradford continues to go on and says, and who is to judge whether voters thus on their way to the place of voting have given aid, comfort, or encouragement to persons engaged in rebellion, or that they do not recognize their allegiance to the United States and may avail themselves of the presence of the polls to force the enemies of the United States into power, but the provost marshals and the military officials were thus ordered to arrest the approaching voters. All right, so now almost immediately, President Lincoln chimes in. Almost immediately, before this order never got published, Lincoln sends Bradford a telegram. And he says, there's somebody else, I'm going to send you a letter by courier. The letter came that night, 10:30 night. And part of that letter he says, Lincoln says to Governor Bradford, I feel to be my duty to solemnly protest against such, I'm one ahead of myself. The Governor Bradford also said it was his duty to protest intervention of privileges of the ballot box. So that was in the governor's proclamation that never got published, and we'll see why. Now we have Lincoln sends his communication to Governor Bradford. And then it says, nor do I think to keep the peace at the polls and to prevent the persistently disloyal from voting continues just cause of offense to Maryland. If I mistake not, it is precisely what General Dix, when your excellency was elected governor. So Lincoln's basically saying here, well, General Dix did it at the polls, you got elected, so what are you complaining about? But also notice the disloyal, term disloyal. What's disloyal? You don't support the war. We find in the Senate's investigation that military orders were sent to the Eastern Shore, directed its circulation to be suppressed. The public papers were forbidden to publish it. And an embargo was laid upon steamers in port that traded with that part of the state, lest they might carry the governor's proclamation. That's what the Senate report, and of course I like to do my own research, and I found this in the War Rebellion. It's an order to the Baltimore American newspaper. And it's from General Schneck. You are directed not to publish in your newspaper or in any other form a proclamation by the governor dated in Annapolis this day and signed by His Excellency A.W. Bradford. Wow. Wow. Suppression of the First Amendment, military rule over an elected civilian authority, proof of election fraud, folks. This is called a smoking gun right here. And this is called primary evidence. We saw what the Senate wrote. I backed it up, as I do with all my historians from those times, with my own research to find actual evidence. Huge. Talk about the voter suppression in 63. We already talked, there was pre-election arrest. There's placards at the polls and disloyally arrested. They arrested some election judges who protested. The union officers had a list of citizens they considered disloyal, we're going to let them vote. And there was interrogations and test oaths taken if you wanted to vote. And this all comes from the Senate's report and findings. We found that most of the polls, the Union soldiers created a corridor up to the ballot box. And most of them had their weapons with bayonets. A lot had their swords right on their shoulders. And guess what? All the ballots are color coded. If you're gonna vote a certain party ticket, you had a certain color ballot. So you can see exactly how you voted. We found beatings of voters. We found that when voters were forced to vote the unconditional union ticket. We found where union soldiers voted freely in Maryland elections, and sometimes they voted often. They did. This is in the report in the Maryland Senate. You can go online. You can go on your cell phone and bring up this report. It's all online now. And this is kind of the supporting documents. One, this is an affidavit from one of our Maryland citizens. I have his name, but it's not pertinent. It goes, I hereby certify that I offer to vote the conservative union ticket, and that a soldier objected to my voting on the grounds of disloyalty, that my ticket was taken from my hand at the same time by a soldier, and that I left the polls and had not proceeded further than 30 or 40 feet before a soldier came up to me and said, here, you are entitled to a vote. Now come and vote. And at the same time, he placed the unconditional ticket into my hand and seizing me by one of my arms and another soldier by the other arm. I was forced again back to the polls through fear of personal violence and compelled to vote against my sentiments. This is what happens when the First Amendment gets suppressed. Government can start doing what they want. Is this a lesson for today? I don't know. I mean, you can, but it happened. The Senate report states in some cases it's fully shown that soldiers were bidden to vote who were strangers of the counties, non-residents. We talked about that. And the investigation says that large bodies of soldiers, which were everywhere distributed throughout the state, their appearance and conduct in polls, the violent arrest of election judges, their threatened arrest of others were well calculated, if not designed to intimidate the less bold and to keep at home the weak, the old, and the infirmed. And this is really interesting. This is from the Maryland Senate in 1864. They're all unionists. They sound like the Maryland legislature in 1861. And here's how they wrap up the report. But nothing can so speedily ensure the downfall of the republic and make the people the slaves of power as the corruption of these privileges. Their legitimate exercise entrenched upon the invaded, the public will overthrown, and a state made easy prey to some despot, military otherwise, who upon the ruins of the Constitution will erect the power from which must issue edicts of a tyrant. So you kind of get an idea what's, and you're right. If you loot the ballot box, destroy the ballot box, we do not have democracy anymore. Proof for the numbers: vote count for Baltimore City was down 62%. The counties of Maryland was down 22%. And that wraps up the election of 63. You go online and read the report. Now, to try to quickly talk about some Talbot Civil War history. I call this the myth cleanup. And I'm going to do individual classes on General Tillman and Carmichael individually in April. But we're going to touch on stuff here that I found in my research. First of all, General Tillman, he was a grandson of the Lieutenant Colonel Tench Tillman, a great Revolutionary War patriot, aide-de-camp of General Washington. Everybody knows he was a subject of the fake news that was disseminated worldwide in August of 1861. And what I found was right here that this fake news has become entwined in our history, even to this day. We have a lot of this propaganda entwined because Dixon Preston repeated it in his book. And he basically said that the New York papers had carried the reports of Tillman gathering arms with him and enlisting recruits for the South. And that the New York Herald, according to Herald, he was about to take command of a large body of troops at Accomack. That was the fake news. Now, when you review Dixon Preston, you realize that his scope of research was right here in Talbot. He didn't go to the archives, he didn't go out. So how did he know about the New York Herald article? Well, Dixon Preston, a New Yorker, was the editor of the Star Democrat at this time, and he looked in the papers, the Gazette and the Star, because they carried it. That's how General Tillman found out. Can you imagine a rumor mill in Talbot County when they read the papers? About General Tillman? I didn't know he was such a secessionist. He's the leader. Oh my God. The fake news that started in 61 is now repeated 100 years later. And then it's repeated in modern times. This is part of a big article. We had this big law with Talbot boys and women interested in Civil War history. And I taught Maryland Civil War courses at a community college for several years. Many of the facts provided here came directly from Dixon Preston. So we see it coming down through the ages today. Those boys were part of a secessionist militia headed by General Tillman. again, from 1861 through present today. And he was essentially calling for his militia to rebel against the U.S. government. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's first look at his order he issued to his second division. He issued an order to get him ready to fight. Order date, April 22nd, 1861. First class, we talked about what happened on April 19th, the Baltimore riots. But if you recall what happened on April 21st, we had General Butler and his Massachusetts militia was in the process of taking over Maryland's capital. And Governor Hicks says, do not land here, and Butler landed his militia anyhow. And back to General Tillman's order, so that background. We also had the newspapers reporting about Baltimore's going to be destroyed, going to float every living thing down to Chesapeake, going to take over Maryland, a lot of war rhetoric in the newspapers. And so back to let's read his order. Our fellow citizens of Baltimore have been slaughtered on our own soil by the soldiers of the U.S. government, which claims their support, whilst it wages war on our institutions. Referring to April 19th, our state has been made a separate military department, and they're dividing Maryland up, and General Dix is going to control whatever, actually Banks or Butler at the time. Our forts have been garrisoned and our state overrun by Northern troops in open defiance of the wishes of our citizens and of the appeals from our constituted authorities. And I think this refers to Governor Hicks telling General Butler, do not land here, and Butler's taking over now. So he goes on in his order. He says, I call as your commander to rally to defense your property and your homes. So enroll yourselves immediately into companies of two classes. One to defend your homes, and the other for service in any part of the state. I hereby command the officers of the division to use their utmost efforts to effect these objects and to hold themselves in constant readiness to sustain the civil authorities and to protect its defenses and happiness. What is the order here? Hold yourselves in readiness to sustain the civil authorities. If the governor calls us, I want my command ready for action. Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, I was a Marine Corps officer for 10 years. That's called a warning order. There's nothing treasonous or unconstitutional about that. Even still, Governor Hicks, when he takes away General Tillman's commission, we found on May 6th. Remember what happened there in May? The attack against Baltimore. On May 6th, we also saw a proclamation by Colonel Trimble to stand down the Baltimore militia. All the military of Baltimore and Maryland was standing down to prevent the attack. Because General Scott said the only thing will stop this attack if they freely open Baltimore, and that's what they did. They stood down the militia. At the same time, Governor Hicks took away General Tillman's commission and also stood down the 2nd Division of Maryland militia. I, Thomas Holiday Hicks, Governor of Maryland, do by this proclamation and joined upon the commissioned officers in said 2nd Division not to obey the orders of said 10th Tillman, inasmuch as he does not hold a lawful commission in the 2nd Division and is therefore without authority to issue any military orders. Interesting. Additional research for Lafond. Got it. I found that the Maryland State Legislature investigated all this. There's a lot of stuff in there. And we found that Hicks did that because they had changed the law. When you take a promoter or take a new commander, you got to take oath of your commission. The state legislature had changed how you did that. So General Tillman and others weren't informed. They did it under the old method. And so Hicks goes, you don't have a commission. And that was his legal basis. And Hicks also did it to other military officers, not just Tillman. Okay, 26 September, General Tillman was arrested at his home in Finhaven by order of Lieutenant Colonel Bailey. I did not find anything where he received the attention of Secretary Seward or Secretary Cameron. You would think that such leading secessionists with a leading army would have the attention of Seward or Cameron, unless they also knew that it was false information. His house and papers were searched. He found some old muskets from the military academy established in Oxford, and he was taken over to Cambridge for interrogation by General Lockwood. He was detained for 8 days and found to have committed no disloyal acts. And he was released on parole on October 4th on very liberal terms, and he was required to take an oath. And I found here in the Baltimore Sun, after examination, he was honorably discharged and returned to his home. We're hearing a different story about General Tillman than when we heard from press and others in modern times. But that's not the end of it. Let's not forget, there are national archives. And in our national archives are the whole file of General Tillman, and here's some of the stuff I found. And this is in the handwriting of Union Officer 63. It goes, I am advised he was long since arrested as a Southern sympathizer, had a full investigation, was honorably acquitted of all the charges brought against him. Notwithstanding this, he was placed on his parole. Primary source, this is evidence. Investigated, he's an innocent man, and his reputation has been ruined to this day, and his descendants still live in this area. It gets better. We recall the fake news that he was going to take command of the rebel army down in Accomack. Well, guess what? General Tillman actually owned land in Accomack, Virginia, Eastern Shore, and he needed to go there for some business in the fall of '63. So he put up a chain of command, saying, I'd like to go to Virginia, but my parole doesn't let me leave Talbot. So here's another letter on General Tillman's behalf by the Union officer. Actually, this is on the War Department right here. I can't remember which general wrote this. But it is represented that General Tench Tillman of Oxford, Maryland, has property in Accomack and the neighboring counties of the Eastern Shore of Virginia, the protection of which requires his presence, and that he is stopped by a parole from going there. This department is satisfied that it would not be prejudicial to the public interest to relax General Key's parole, so far as allow him to visit Eastern Shore of Virginia to attend his private business. Wow, they weren't concerned with this general at all. The leading secessionist in Talbot County. But what's even more surprising is that General Tillman gets this letter from the War Department, Adjutant General. And it says, War Department, Adjutant General's Office, Washington, November 13, 1863. Tench Tillman, Esquire, Oxford, Maryland. Sir, I have the honor hereby to relieve you of any direction, by the direction of the Secretary of War, from the operation of any parole you may have given to the military authorities of the United States. In November 1863, General Tillman was totally relieved of parole. And it's obvious that the War Department thinks that General Tillman is actually no threat. And it's also obvious that he was investigated and acquitted. I think this myth has been perpetuated General Tillman beginning in 1861 in August about leading the rebel army, perpetuated by Dixon Preston in 81. At least Dixon Preston said, well, he denied it, and perpetuated in recent times by local historians, continuing. I think that myth is busted by good sources. Now let's go to Richard Bennett Carmichael. Served several terms in the Maryland legislature. He served as U.S. Congressman, circuit court judge for Talbot and Queen Anne's counties. He was beaten in his own courtroom, in prison without charges or trial. After he was in prison, the War Department issued fake news that he was in prison for treason, and I found the fake news again in every major paper in the United States and every English-speaking paper of Europe. What Carmichael is very interested also here in the Carmichael affair is what I call historical revisionism. Scarf, 1879, talked about why Carmichael was arrested. Dixon Preston did 100 years later, and then our local Civil War historian did in modern times. Preston, even though he didn't have footnotes and citations in the back of the book, he did say, I got my sources from this book or that book. And he said, on Carmichael, I used Dante's Scarf. And a modern historian says I used Preston. But look how things change. Scarf says, an upright, honored, and venerable judge beaten, wounded, dragged bleeding from the bench for upholding the Constitution that he swore to maintain. That's what Scarf says, for upholding the Constitution. Dixon Preston says, Judge Carmichael was asserting that the state civil powers are superior to those of the federal government. Living change. And now in modern times, we see Judge Carmichael of the U.S. Circuit Court of the Eastern Shore, well, he wasn't a federal judge, but either way, brazenly undermined any effort by the federal troops to suppress secessionist activities until he was removed in May 1862. Do you see a change of history here from one person to the next downrange? But what is the real story of Judge Carmichael? I think I told you in first class, he, with 48 others, sent a petition to the state legislature in June of 1861. And here's what the petition said. And I told you then, he was basically outlining what was happening on the Eastern Shore, what he saw. And in the petition he said, they have seized private citizens without warrant of law. They have deprived them of their liberty without a hearing before a judge or jury. They have a military force within their border without sanction of the legislature. They have set the military above civil power, and they have subjected persons to martial law, civilians to martial law. The habeas corpus has been suspended. Now here's June 1861, habeas corpus suspended in Queen Anne's County. I thought it was just along the corridor along Baltimore and Washington. In my book, I found that habeas corpus was basically suspended as soon as Union troops arrived in that particular part of Maryland. The right of the people to bear arms has been infringed, and the militia of the state is being disarmed, thereby depriving us of the best security of a free state. Anyone think this is treason against the United States? Here's the smoking gun. General Seward, October 3rd, 1861, General Dix, in the War Rebellion. I enclose a letter of the 28th Alphabet and its accompaniments. And the accompaniments was that petition from Carmichael Freer. That was what the attachment was. And that's addressed to Mr. Cameron, Secretary of War, by J. Hopkins Tarr from Denton. Personally, I think his tar guy should be feathered. But anyway, on the eastern shore of Maryland, relative to J.D. Carmichael of that quarter. It seems to me that the functionary should be arrested, even in his court if need be, and sent to Fort Lafayette. Wow. Wow. Now we know why Seward wanted Carmichael arrested, and it's because his petition. Wow. Is this an usurpation of power? I think so. General Dixon arrests Carmichael in October. And in walks, next person on the scene was H.H. Goldsboro. This is new stuff, by the way. No historians found this. This is my own research. Goldsboro was a state senator from Talbot County. He was president of the state senate. He was considered the leading unconditional unionist in the state legislature. He also was a Democrat and a slave owner. He had 10 slaves according to the state schedule. And lots of people believe the Democrats are trying to slave owners, and Maryland was a mixed match. We had plenty of Democrats and slave owners that were staunch unionists. Holiday and Governor Hicks is a perfect example of that. He also voted nay on the famous Wallace Report, so he did not go to prison. But during a political speech in the Chapel District of Talbot County, there were some hecklers. James, the Slaughter brothers, and Perry Stevens, and in these men were later arrested by Union officers at the direction of Goldsboro. Okay, arrest of civilians. Talbot County's district attorney, J.C.W. Powell, had a problem with that, and he brought charges to Talbot's grand jury, who indicted the Union officers involved in the arrest, and also indicted Goldsboro for conducting the unlawful arrest and prison civilians. Judge Carmichael advised the jury on the applicable law, and the officers indicted was simply transferred out of Talbot's jurisdiction. That's what he did. There's other indictments that happened, he just transferred out, but unfortunately, he lived in Easton. He couldn't quite easily leave the jurisdiction of Talbot County, and he was stand trial in May 1862, where he participated in unlawful arrests and imprisonment of civilians. And here's the other smoking gun. General Dix, headquarters, May 23, 1862. To the Honorable H.H. Goldsboro, dear sir, I send 4 officers who are summoned as witnesses in your case. I also send Mr. McPhail and 3 policemen, well armed. He goes on to say, the Deputy Provost Marshal, Mr. McPhail, is authorized on consultation with you to arrest him and bring him to Fort McHenry. I am willing to act on your judgment. At this distance, I cannot give Mr. McPhail positive instructions, but I leave him to the exercise under your advice and sound discretion. General Dix told Goldsboro, who's getting ready to go for trial, it's your authority if you want the judge in prison. You know what Goldsboro did. He had Carmichael and the district attorney imprisoned. And oh, by the way, Goldsboro later went on in the 63 election. He got elected controller of the state. And not long after, he got appointed judge and replaced Carmichael. How interesting in that. You can't make this stuff up. Kind of know what happened? Carmichael was bloodily beaten while in his courtroom, and those who attempted to come to his aid were also beaten. Front book of my cover, one of the better images of Democracy Fallen when provost marshals are driving the judge from the courthouse. Physically dragged to the Talbot courthouse. By that time, there was 125 Union soldiers circling the courthouse. Both Carmichael and the district attorney Powell and others were in prison without charges or trial. Habeas corpus was denied. And the trial against Goldsboro went away. And then we see the fake news disseminated. Here it is in England. And it was a charge of treason. And in fact, the Maryland Archives had it in Cormack's biography, and he was charged for treason. That's why I wrote down about 2 years ago with documentation, right? He was never charged with treason. Still not done. We have General Dix's after action report. And he says, it was on full consideration that the arrest should be made in court in order that the proceedings might be more marked. It was a positive decision to arrest this judge and his court. More marked for who? Probably the citizens of Talbot County. Even Dixon Preston says many people turned away from the union in Talbot County. And so that's interesting. Did it have an impact on both Talbot counties? You bet it did. So anyway, I think the myth on Goldsboro is busted, that he was supporting secession activities. He got identified by Seward for his petition of the legislature. He got arrested, so H.H. Goldsboro, a very strong political unionist, would not stand trial. And the Talbot counties react, you bet they did. This is a graph of the enlistment dates of all the Talbot counties that joined the Confederacy. And right here is a Carmichael incident. And we see this huge spike in enlistments. In fact, you back up. Of the 85 Confederates of Talbot County, we found records for about 85% of them. We didn't find records for all, 85%. And we found this huge spike in enlistments right here. Carmichael's here. And we found there was a delay from when you left Talbot County to when you'd be in Richmond, depends on which route you went, anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks delay. And get your affairs in order. That this spike in enlistments for Confederacy corresponds with Carmichael imprisonment. This is unique for Talbot County. Throughout the rest of Maryland, all the Confederate enlistments in this part was 61. The rest of Maryland did not have a spike right here. It's correlated to Carmichael. 54% of all our Confederates went during this time. I put this line right here. What does that mean? That's the Emancipation Proclamation. Like it did it January 1st, 1863. Prior to that, everyone believed the war was for the Union only. Slavery would remain afterwards. And after the Emancipation Proclamation, even though it didn't impact the slave states that were in the Union, they realized that the war was going to be for Union and emancipation. So that was it. And we had 4 Talbot Countyans that went Confederate. One of them was Francis F. Tillman. We saw got arrested. They tried to look for a surveyor. And his record said, we found a records National Archive. They won't let you work in Maryland. And they did that. As part of disloyal, they wouldn't let you work in your jobs. And he said, I got a family and wife to take care of. And it was very, very, this didn't sit well during a debate at that time. There was a lot of revisionist history going on. During the debate of the Talbot Boys, there was a lot, the other side was arguing that there was no constitutional abuses going on in Maryland. And habeas corpus suspension was extremely limited, only between Baltimore. It wasn't used to oppress Marylanders. And that the secessionists of Talbot County were attempting to declare Talbot a Confederacy. So this is why I got involved in this debate. I saw revisionism. I grew up here. I heard stories from my grandfather. I love this history. I researched for many years. And to hear these arguments, no constitutional abuses committed in Maryland. Habeas corpus suspended was extremely limited. It wasn't used to oppress or for political purposes. And that's why I started studying more, and that's probably why I wrote this book, to get the story out. And here's just a couple of articles in the Star Democrat. This is part of very, very large articles. Habeas corpus suspended within 20 miles of Baltimore and Washington was actually much more. Not to control politics through the state. Habeas corpus not to oppress Marylanders, and we got Talbot secessionist leaders were to effect martial law and declare the county a Confederate entity. Really, I call it revisionist, not based in fact. And upon the research, my research of that graph was published. Me and others actually published a whole article of our findings of what we found in the research. And the revisionists of Talbot County could not stand that, and they denied it. And he said, there are no Confederate records in existence that confirm enlistment dates or discharges. It doesn't happen. And there's even a question whether Tench Francis Tillman ever actually joined the Confederate military. And the Battle of Gettysburg was the only battle in the entire war in which the Talbot Boys actually participated in. So there's no records. And to show you here, again, National Archives, Tench Tillman, why he enlisted, and his enlistment records. And we found enlistment records of many of our Confederates in the archives, dates when enlisted, their names. We would have been greater than 85%, but some of them, the warrant didn't have the initials, exactly how many exact initials if possible. There were also other sources. More enlisted records, more enlisted records, more enlisted records, more. We also had a diary we found of Oswald Tillman did another diary, we used him, but this is of Lyons. It's several, 4 or 5 of them. And not only did it document August 82, then you go into the Confederacy, that got to show us at the time it took, once he physically started to leave, how long it took before he got to Richmond. And that's not a count also preparing to your time at home. That's how we see Carmichael was in it, and there's about a month in the huge spike. It took anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks when he physically stepped off. Here's Edward Gibson. This is actually this is probably an obituary, but he's found that he had served from Bull Run to Appomattox. He was at Gettysburg, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, in all the battles. So it kind of refutes the revisionism that Talbot County is only fought at Gettysburg. And of course, as many of you know, I'm a Marine Corps officer. We know that I'm part of the Navy, so naval warfare, I'm very interested in. And Talbot County is we're part of the incredible change of naval warfare. And we see it right here. Look at the lithograph. Last of the wooden Navy. That'll be a Talbot County in command of the Merrimack in the battle against the Continent. Now, you can say he's a traitor in the nation, but he was part of huge history in doing that, change naval warfare. Another Talbot County we found through DNA evidence was a guy named Ridgway from Chilton, Maryland. And again, through the research on Hunley, we found he also left in the summer 1862, about August, I think, and he was second command on the submarine ship Hunley, and that was the first time a submarine ever sank a surface vessel in warfare, in combat. Changed naval warfare forever. They lost his life after he delivered the bomb. They sank, and they found his DNA evidence. They took DNA from his descendants on Tillman Island and confirmed that was him. Okay, where am I now? That's about as far as I want to go. We're out of time anyhow. A little bit of my book. My book presents new information that had never been presented for over 100 years. The federal attack against Baltimore, the last we saw that written about was like in 1901 by George Radcliffe. The fake news put out by the War Department, that was my own find that had never been reported on. Actual reasons for legislation's arrest. Wallace Doc, the Wallace Report, and that's kind of new information. Federal manipulations of Maryland elections, no one really wrote about that in my research. Information pertaining to General Tillman, I found his records that he was honorably acquitted of all charges. That's new and never before been presented before my book. Along with Judge Carmichael, where we found the letter from Dix about his treasonous report to the legislature. I want him in Fort Lafayette, and how Goldsboro, the senator, had the authority to arrest Carmichael. And that was the reason for the arrest. And then the arrest was intentionally done in his courtroom to make it more marked. A few myths, I think, are busted, but it's up to you. What do you think when you read my book or hear my lecture? But the legislature in prison to prevent Maryland secession. I told you that being the last class. Everyone believes that. I think the myth is busted. General Tillman was organized as a secessionist militia here in Talbot County. It's busted. General Tillman was relieved of command for calls. Busted. It was a technicality. He takes his life. And it was because the governor wanted to stand down the militia to prevent the attack upon Baltimore. And then Judge Carmichael was in prison because he was undermining federal troops to suppress secessionists. And we kind of busted that myth also, as you heard here. So, I know I'm a fast speaker. I've probably gone over my time by 5 minutes, probably, when we started. It's a lot of information, folks, and I hope you can appreciate the amount of detail and research in this. It's what about, I don't like to read a historian and see what he says. All my research, I'd read a historian, like I read Dixon Preston, and I told him he had an excellent guy, but he didn't quite get it. And I'd use that as a stepping stone to do this research using modern research techniques, where I go into the archives online. I can go into the War Rebellion, I can go into newspapers and start putting all this stuff together to find out supportive documentation of what you said. But early Maryland historians, I basically documented they were correct. For Dixon Preston, I'm sorry, he kind of plugged in, he was a New Englander, he was in New York. What he didn't understand, he just plugged in this, and it's a very bad portrayal. On his defense, though, Preston was trying to do a very large book, and he only had 20-some pages on the Civil War. And he put in the back, he didn't source it, he put in the back that, hey, this is not for scholarly study, for scholarly review. I did this for general readership, that's why I didn't source things. So it's not for scholarly study, but yet it had been used as the absolute history of our county, which was incorrect. Any questions? Who's going to have the first question? Okay, Mickey, the first question. Yes, Mickey.
Well, I think you've done a marvelous job researching.